15 black R&B legends who hid they were gay until the day they died. They gave America the greatest love songs of all time, yet many could not live freely behind the spotlight. These black music legends sold millions, shaped generations, and became the soundtrack to our lives. But the industry had an unspoken rule: protect the image and bury the truth. In an era where one rumor could end everything, silence was not a choice. It was survival. This is not cheap gossip. It is the hidden cost of fame and the secrets history tried to erase. Stay to the end because each story will change how you hear these songs forever. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you think. The Black Excellence List. Luther Vandross. A love singer can fill stadiums and still live like he is under surveillance. Luther Vandross was not merely successful. He was engineered for romance, a voice so controlled and so intimate it made people stop talking mid-sentence. In the 1980s and 1990s, he became a permanent part of American life, the sound of anniversaries, slow dances, and late-night radio. By the height of his career, he was widely recognized as an R&B powerhouse, with 8 Grammy Awards and a run of multi-platinum albums that helped define modern soul. Yet the image the public adored, the polished gentleman, the master of devotion, came with a quieter discipline. Luther guarded his personal world with extreme care, keeping interviews tightly focused on music and refusing to let curiosity turn into a headline. People close to him later described how serious that boundary was, shaped by an industry that could turn private life into public punishment overnight. Then the story shifted from control to fragility. On April 16, 2003, Vandross suffered a severe stroke at his home in New York, an emergency that left him in a coma for weeks and changed his ability to perform. Even so, his work kept moving through the culture. In 2004, Dance with My Father received major Grammy recognition, and Luther appeared via video as his family accepted on his behalf a moment that felt both triumphant and heartbreaking. Would his love songs feel different to you if the man singing them never felt fully safe, living his own truth out loud? Luther Vandross died on July 1, 2005 at age 54. The legacy is not only the catalog, but the contradiction. He taught the world how to sound fearless in love while living with the careful restraint of someone who understood the cost of being fully seen. Arthur Conley. A hit can change your life and still leave you nowhere safe to stand. Arthur Conley arrived in the late 1960s like a firecracker in a church choir, bright, loud, and impossible to ignore. In 1967, sweet soul music rocketed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, a record so energetic it felt like a victory lap for an entire scene. The single sold over 1 million copies and earned a gold disc, turning Conley into an overnight name in a business that rarely offered black Southern artists instant elevation. In public, he looked like the perfect new soul star, sharp suits, confident grin, and a voice that made the party sound classy. But stardom in that era came with invisible rules. The industry wanted charm without complications, romance without questions, and a personal life that stayed off the record. Conley lived under the double pressure of being a black man in segregated America and working inside a marketplace that punished anything seen as different. Friends and observers later described him growing more guarded, careful about where he went, who he trusted, and what could be misunderstood. If the song gave him freedom on stage, the world often took it back the moment he stepped off. What is the point of being celebrated if you cannot relax into your own life? By the mid-1970s, Conley made a choice that surprised fans and protected his peace. He left the United States and relocated to Europe, eventually settling in the Netherlands and legally changing his name to Lee Roberts. Away from the American spotlight, he built a quieter career, performing and producing on his own terms, even if it meant trading mass fame for breathing room. Arthur Conley died in Ruurlo, Netherlands on November 17, 2003, after a battle with intestinal cancer. He was 57. His legacy now carries two sounds at once: the joyous blast of sweet soul music and the softer echo of a man who proved that sometimes the bravest move is not to chase the spotlight, but to walk away from it. Nona Hendryx. She walked onto the stage like a warning siren, not a sweetheart. Nona Hendryx became famous inside a storm of sequins, science fiction, and soul. As a founding member of LaBelle, she helped turn Lady Marmalade into a cultural earthquake, a song that hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in March 1975 and made the group impossible to ignore. But Hendryx was never only a performer. She was the mind in the machine, widely described as LaBelle's chief songwriter during their boundary-pushing era writing material that mixed desire politics and futuristic imagination long before Afrofuturism had a mainstream name. That public boldness, however, did not mean personal safety. The music business loved selling liberation while privately policing it, especially for black women expected to fit a narrow fantasy. Hendryx was pushing against multiple walls at once: sexism, racism, and the quiet threat that anything outside the approved script could be used to shrink your opportunities. In later years, she was openly described as bisexual and connected to LGBTQ advocacy. But that kind of clarity was not something the industry made easy during her commercial peak. Instead of surrendering, Hendryx reinvented. After LaBelle, she moved through genres like a shapeshifter solo records, collaborations, and work across theater and multimedia, choosing creative risk over predictable branding. Her impact now lands in two places at once. She is remembered for helping redefine what an all-female black group could look like in pop culture, and for proving that identity, whether spoken loudly or guarded carefully, can still leave fingerprints on the art. Nona Hendryx did not just sing the future, she helped write it. Keith Barrow. Some voices arrive softly and still leave a bruise when they disappear. Keith Barrow emerged in the late 1970s as one of soul music's most promising young voices. Raised in Chicago and shaped by gospel roots, he carried a smooth, controlled delivery that felt intimate rather than flashy. His early recordings, including You Know You Want to Be Loved and Turn Me Up, earned attention on R&B charts and positioned him as a rising talent during the disco-soul crossover era. Industry insiders spoke of him as an artist with star potential, handsome, disciplined, and capable of carrying both romance and restraint in a single phrase. For audiences, he represented polish and promise at a time when soul music was evolving fast. Behind that promise, however, was a quieter struggle. The late 70s and early 80s were unforgiving for black male singers whose private lives did not align with rigid public expectations. Barrow was known to be intensely private, rarely offering details beyond the studio or the stage. Friends later suggested that this distance was not arrogance, but protection. The industry demanded a specific image of masculinity, and desire and deviation carried consequences few were willing to risk. Keith poured emotion into performance while carefully limiting exposure everywhere else. How heavy does silence become when honesty feels more dangerous than loneliness? The turning point came not through scandal, but tragedy. In 1983, Keith Barrow died at just 29 years old from complications related to AIDS at a moment when fear and misinformation dominated public conversation. His death was quietly acknowledged but rarely discussed in depth, reflecting the stigma of the era as much as the loss itself. A career that once seemed ready to bloom was suddenly sealed in a short catalog of recordings. Keith Barrow's legacy lives in absence as much as sound. He is remembered not for controversy, but for what might have been. His story stands as a reminder of how many artists carried brilliance in one hand and caution in the other, leaving behind music that whispers about a future they were never given time to reach. Little Richard. He terrified polite America by refusing to stay in one shape. Little Richard did not ease his way into history. He kicked the door open with pompadour hair, screaming vocals, and a piano style that sounded like the church set on fire. Born Richard Wayne Penniman in 1932, he became one of the first black artists to cross over to mainstream white audiences, helping lay the foundation for rock and roll while still rooted in rhythm and blues. Songs like Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Good Golly Miss Molly sold millions and influenced everyone from Elvis Presley to the Beatles. On stage, he was pure explosion. Loud, glittering, joyful, and impossible to ignore. Yet behind that fearless performance lived constant conflict. Raised in a deeply religious household, Richard struggled for decades with identity, faith, and public expectation. He blurred gender and sexuality through makeup, flamboyant clothing, and movement, while often contradicting himself in interviews about who he was and what he believed. At different moments in his life, he described himself as gay, bisexual, omnisexual, or repentant and reborn. These shifts were not confusion for show. They reflected the pressure of being a black pioneer in mid-20th century America, carrying fame, racism, religious guilt, and public scrutiny all at once. His career followed those inner battles. At times, he walked away from secular music, entirely retreating into the church. At other times, he returned to the stage louder than ever, reclaiming his crown as an originator. Despite the turmoil, his influence never faded. James Brown Prince and countless others credited him as a blueprint for freedom in performance, even when personal freedom remained complicated. Little Richard died in 2020 at the age of 87. His legacy is larger than any label. He did not just change music. He challenged America to confront what it feared in sound, style, and identity. Even when he wrestled with himself, the path he carved made it possible for others to live more openly than he ever could. Johnny Mathis. He built a career on intimacy while keeping his own life carefully out of reach. Johnny Mathis entered American music like a whisper that refused to fade. Emerging in the late 1950s, his velvet tenor turned ballads into events, transforming songs like Misty and Chances Are into permanent fixtures of the American songbook. With an image built on elegance and restraint, Mathis became the definition of the romantic gentleman, selling more than 300 million records worldwide and earning a place among the best-selling vocalists in recording history. Audiences trusted him. His voice sounded sincere, controlled, and timeless, a refuge from a noisy world. That polished calm masked a lifetime of caution. As a black singer navigating pop and R&B during the civil rights era, Mathis already carried immense pressure. Adding personal disclosure to that burden was not a realistic option. In 1982, a brief magazine quote in which he acknowledged homosexuality appeared almost casually, then vanished into silence. The moment caused quiet shock, followed by decades of avoidance. Mathis neither denied nor expanded on it, choosing instead to retreat into privacy. He continued performing, rarely granting personal interviews, allowing the music to speak while the man behind it remained deliberately undefined. What does it cost to protect your art by erasing yourself from the conversation? Unlike many of his peers, Mathis did not implode or disappear. He endured. He toured consistently, maintained vocal control well into later life, and avoided the public scandals that consumed other stars. That discipline preserved his career, but it also reinforced the distance between the audience and the individual. Fans learned to hear layers in his recordings, sensing longing and restraint without ever being invited inside the story. Johnny Mathis remains a study in survival through discretion. His legacy is not built on confession, but on consistency. He proved that in a hostile era, longevity itself could be an act of resistance. The voice offered romance without conditions, even when the man behind it understood that some truths were safer left unsung. Billy Preston. He brought joy to every room while carrying silence like an instrument no one could hear. Billy Preston was a musical prodigy long before the world knew his name. By the age of 3, he was already playing keyboards in church, and before his teenage years ended, he had shared stages with gospel legends and rhythm and blues pioneers. His talent was undeniable. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Preston became a rare bridge between worlds, working with Ray Charles, Little Richard, the Rolling Stones, and most famously, the Beatles. He remains the only musician ever credited as a featured artist on a Beatles single, Get Back, a historic distinction that placed him at the center of popular music history. Publicly, Billy Preston radiated freedom. His solo hits like Outta Space and Nothing from Nothing topped charts, earned Grammy recognition, and showcased a performer who looked fearless, smiling, and full of life. Yet behind the vibrant performances was a man navigating an industry that rewarded talent, but punished difference. Friends and collaborators later described Preston as deeply private, careful about his personal life, and exhausted by the effort of constant self-control. He lived in an era when being openly gay as a black male artist could cost contracts, collaborators, and safety. As his career continued, Preston faced mounting struggles. Legal troubles, financial strain, and declining health weighed heavily on him. Diagnosed with kidney disease and later requiring dialysis, his physical strength faded, but his musical reputation never did. Even as his public presence dimmed, his influence remained embedded in the sound of modern soul rock and funk. Billy Preston died in 2006 at the age of 59. The legacy he left behind is layered. He is remembered as a musical connector, a genius who moved effortlessly across genres and cultures. Yet his story also stands as a quiet testament to the cost of silence. He gave the world liberation through sound while living much of his life bound by restraint, proving that brilliance does not always come with freedom. Donny Hathaway. His voice sounded like hope breaking through pain. Donny Hathaway emerged as one of the most gifted musicians of the early 1970s, a classically trained pianist and arranger whose soul voice carried unusual depth. Raised in Chicago and educated at Howard University, he quickly stood apart for his musical intelligence as much as his emotion. Songs like A Song for You and Someday We Will All Be Free were not just hits, they were statements. His duets with Roberta Flack crossed genres and generations, earning Grammy recognition and placing him among the most respected artists of his era. On stage and in the studio, Hathaway appeared focused, spiritual, and almost otherworldly in control. Behind that brilliance, however, was a life marked by profound struggle. Hathaway battled severe mental illness and was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that complicated his relationships, work schedule, and sense of safety. Colleagues described moments of intense inspiration followed by periods of fear and withdrawal. He lived in a time when mental health was poorly understood and rarely discussed, especially for black men expected to project strength at all costs. Rumors and speculation followed him, but Hathaway himself rarely spoke about his private life, choosing instead to let his music carry what words could not. When you hear that voice trembling with honesty, are you listening to performance or confession? As the pressure mounted, the cracks became harder to hide. Recording sessions were interrupted by paranoia and exhaustion. Friends tried to help, but the system around him offered little support. On January 13, 1979, Donny Hathaway fell to his death from a hotel window in New York City. He was just 33 years old. The official ruling was suicide, a conclusion that stunned the music world and left behind unanswered questions that still linger. Donny Hathaway's legacy is both luminous and tragic. His catalog continues to guide artists like Stevie Wonder, Alicia Keys, and John Legend. He remains a symbol of rare musical purity and a reminder of how easily genius can be overwhelmed when care arrives too late. His songs still promise freedom, even as his life reveals how fragile that promise once was. Marvin Gaye. He sang desire like a confession and lived like a man at war with himself. Marvin Gaye did not sound like Motown. He sounded like its conscience. Rising from gospel roots in Washington, D.C., he became one of the defining voices of American music in the 1960s and 70s. Hits like Ain't No Mountain High Enough, Let's Get It On, and Sexual Healing sold millions, while the album What's Going On reshaped soul music into a vehicle for social reflection. With more than 25 top 10 singles, Marvin was not just successful, he was essential. His voice carried intimacy, vulnerability, and authority, all at once, a rare balance that made listeners feel both desired and understood. But behind that mastery was constant inner conflict. Gaye was raised in a strict religious household under a domineering father whose judgment followed him into adulthood. Fame did not quiet that voice. It amplified it. Marvin struggled with identity, faith, depression, and addiction, often retreating from the world even as his music demanded exposure. Rumors and speculation about his private life circulated for decades, fueled by his emotional openness and refusal to fit neatly into any category. Marvin never clarified those questions publicly. He seemed to understand that explanation would not bring peace. As the years passed, the tension grew heavier. Financial troubles mounted, substance abuse worsened, relationships fractured. Yet even at his lowest moments, Marvin could still create work that felt redemptive, as if music was the only place he could speak freely without consequence. That contradiction defined him. On April 1, 1984, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his father during a domestic dispute one day before his 45th birthday. The tragedy stunned the world and sealed his image as both genius and casualty. His legacy endures not only in timeless songs, but in the warning his life carries. Marvin Gaye showed America how to feel deeply, while quietly demonstrating what happens when a sensitive soul is left without refuge. Whitney Houston. Her smile sold perfection while her voice carried ache. Whitney Houston arrived as an event, not a debut. From the moment her first album topped charts in the mid-1980s, she was framed as America's sweetheart, a once-in-a-generation voice wrapped in elegance and discipline. With more than 200 million records sold worldwide, she became one of the best-selling artists in music history, delivering era-defining performances like I Will Always Love You, and setting vocal standards few could approach. Publicly, Whitney represented triumph, grace, and crossover success, a black woman welcomed into the center of mainstream culture without resistance. But the image came with strict conditions. Whitney grew up in a powerful gospel family and entered an industry that demanded control over every detail of her life, especially her private one. For years, her closest relationship was with Robin Crawford, a childhood friend who remained by her side as confidant and protector. Their bond sparked constant rumors, which Whitney consistently deflected, understanding that any deviation from the carefully managed narrative could threaten everything she had built. In a business that rewarded vulnerability in song but punished it in life, silence became a form of self-defense. How much of yourself do you give up when the world decides who you are allowed to be? As her career progressed, the pressure intensified. Fame isolated her. Substance abuse followed. Her marriage to Bobby Brown played out publicly, often overshadowing her artistry. Even as her voice showed signs of strain, moments of brilliance still broke through, reminding audiences of the power she carried when unburdened. Years after her death, Robin Crawford confirmed the romantic nature of their relationship, reframing decades of speculation as a story of love deferred rather than denied. Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012, at the age of 48. Her legacy is layered. She remains one of the greatest vocalists in history, but also a symbol of the cost of containment. Whitney taught the world how to feel everything through song, while never being granted the freedom to live that same honesty in full view. Teddy Pendergrass. He turned desire into a voice, then learned how quickly the world could take everything else. Teddy Pendergrass rose in the 1970s as the embodiment of grown man soul. First as the commanding lead singer of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, then as a solo superstar, his baritone made intimacy sound undeniable. Songs like If You Do Not Know Me By Now, Close the Door, and Love. TKO did more than climb the charts. They rewrote how black male vulnerability could sound without losing strength. At his peak, Teddy sold millions of records and filled arenas, famously performing concerts marketed only to women, cementing his image as the ultimate romantic force. But that image required constant control. Pendergrass was intensely private, rarely discussing his personal life beyond faith and music. In an era that demanded rigid masculinity from male stars, speculation followed him quietly but persistently. Teddy never confirmed or denied rumors. He understood that survival in the industry often depended less on truth than on discipline. The voice that sounded fearless was paired with a life carefully guarded from interpretation. Everything changed in March 1982. A devastating car accident left Pendergrass paralyzed from the chest down at just 31 years old. The crash ended his reign as a touring powerhouse and forced a complete redefinition of his identity. Many expected him to disappear. Instead, he returned. His performance at Live Aid in 1985 was not about seduction. It was about endurance. The voice remained. The presence transformed. In the years that followed, Teddy focused on survival, spirituality, and gratitude themes that dominated his later interviews and his autobiography, Truly Blessed. He continued recording and mentoring even as physical pain and public curiosity never fully faded. Teddy Pendergrass died in 2010 at the age of 59. His legacy is not just the sound of desire, but the proof of resilience. He showed that masculinity could include softness, strength, could survive catastrophe and dignity, could exist without explanation. Phyllis Hyman. She could sound like royalty and still feel completely alone. Phyllis Hyman stepped onto the scene with a kind of gravity that did not need hype. Tall, elegant, and anchored by a deep contralto, she made sophisticated R&B feel grown, cinematic, and painfully honest. By the late 1970s, songs like You Know How to Love Me proved she could deliver romance without sounding lightweight, while later work such as Living All Alone turned emotional isolation into something listeners could recognize as their own. On stage, she carried herself with control, the sort of calm that convinces an audience everything is fine, even when the lyric says otherwise. Off stage, the story was messier. Hyman dealt with industry frustrations that many fans never saw: uneven label support, financial strain, and constant pressure to stay marketable in a business that moved on quickly. More importantly, she battled depression, a fight she did not romanticize and could not simply out-sing. In an era that expected Black women to be strong and silent, admitting vulnerability could feel like breaking the rules. Rumors about her private life circulated in music circles, but Phyllis refused to turn her identity into spectacle. She chose discretion, and the music absorbed what she would not explain. When a singer makes loneliness sound this believable, are we hearing artistry or a cry for help? As the years passed, her career did not disappear, but the gap between critical respect and personal stability widened. She kept performing, kept showing up, kept giving audiences beauty, even when her own inner world was collapsing. The tragedy is that the very quality that made her music timeless, emotional truth, also meant she could not hide from her pain forever. On June 30th, 1995, just hours before she was scheduled to appear at the Apollo Theater, Phyllis Hyman died by suicide at 45. Her legacy now lands like a slow song you cannot skip. She remains a voice of elegance and endurance, and a reminder that applause is not the same thing as peace. Billy Paul. He sang Forbidden Love so convincingly that people forgot to ask who he was protecting. Billy Paul stepped into history with a voice that sounded mature, reflective, and quietly dangerous. When Me and Mrs. Jones reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1972 and won a Grammy Award, it turned him into the defining sound of Philadelphia soul. The song was not flashy or youthful. It was patient, restrained, and emotionally complicated, a story about secrecy delivered with elegance. Billy Paul became known as a sophisticated storyteller, a jazz-trained singer who brought adult themes into mainstream R&B without raising his voice. Yet that control extended far beyond the microphone. Paul was famously private even by the standards of his era. While other stars cultivated drama, he avoided interviews and kept his personal life firmly out of reach. Within industry circles, speculation followed him for decades, fueled by his discretion and his refusal to play the expected role of the public romantic lead. Billy never addressed the rumors directly. He understood that in the 1970s, especially for a black male artist, tied to a massive crossover hit, ambiguity could be safer than honesty. As trends shifted, Billy Paul did not chase them. He continued recording albums that blended soul funk and social commentary, working closely with the Philadelphia International Records sound, even as his commercial peak faded. Songs like Am I Black Enough for You showed a willingness to engage politics even while his personal narrative remained sealed. He chose longevity over visibility, dignity over explanation. Billy Paul died in 2016 at the age of 81. His legacy is subtle but lasting. Me and Mrs. Jones still plays like a confession whispered rather than shouted. In hindsight, the song feels symbolic, not just about an affair, but about a man who understood the power of silence. Billy Paul proved that sometimes the most enduring performances come from those who leave the loudest questions unanswered. Sylvester James Jr. He refused to shrink even when the world demanded it. Sylvester James Jr. entered music like a burst of light, radiant and unapologetic in a culture that preferred its stars contained. Raised in church and pushed out for being too different, he found belonging in San Francisco's underground scene where freedom was not an idea, but a necessity. When disco surged in the late 1970s, Sylvester did not follow the wave. He defined it. With You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, his soaring falsetto and ecstatic delivery turned dance floors into sanctuaries, and the song climbed the charts as an anthem of release and survival. On stage, Sylvester was joy made visible, wrapped in glamour, defiance, and spiritual intensity. Yet even that visibility came with limits. While his image was openly gender-fluid and unmistakably queer-coded, Sylvester often let the music speak louder than declarations. The industry embraced the spectacle, but remained uneasy with the person behind it, especially as backlash against disco and LGBTQ communities grew. Sylvester understood the danger of being both black and different in public, particularly as the cultural climate hardened. He chose expression over explanation, pouring truth into performance while guarding parts of his private life from hostile interpretation. When the whole world is watching, is freedom still freedom, if it can be taken away overnight? As the 1980s arrived, the tone shifted. Disco fell out of favor. Radio narrowed its gates, and a new crisis emerged. Sylvester was diagnosed with HY5 at a time when fear outweighed compassion and misinformation spread faster than care. Still, he did not retreat. He continued recording, performing, and supporting AIDS awareness, using what visibility he had left to stand with a community under siege. His strength became quieter, but no less profound. Sylvester died in 1988 at the age of 41. His legacy is not nostalgia. It is permission. He showed that authenticity could exist even under pressure, that joy itself could be an act of resistance. Long after the beat drops, Sylvester remains mighty real. Jermaine Stewart. One song made the world dance, but it could not protect the man who sang it. Jermaine Stewart entered pop culture with a smile that felt effortless and a groove that belonged on every dance floor. After years as a soul-trained dancer and background vocalist, his breakout arrived in 1986 with We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off, a hit that reached the top 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became an international anthem. The record was playful, stylish, and surprisingly restrained for its era, turning Jermaine into a fresh face of 80s pop and R&B. To the public, he represented joy, youth, and color in a decade obsessed with image. Behind that brightness, Stewart lived carefully. The industry celebrated his flamboyant energy on stage, but demanded silence off it. In the shadow of the AIDS crisis and persistent homophobia, being openly gay as a black male pop star carried enormous risk. Jermaine kept his personal life private, redirecting attention back to music and performance whenever curiosity surfaced. Friends later described a man who understood the rules of survival even when those rules felt unfair. As trends shifted in the late 80s and early 90s, Stewart's mainstream momentum slowed, but he did not disappear. He continued recording, touring overseas, and performing for audiences who still embraced his sound and spirit. Away from the spotlight, however, his health declined. Like many artists of his generation, he faced illness during a time when fear and stigma often replaced empathy. Jermaine Stewart died in 1997 at the age of 39 from complications related to AIDS. His passing shocked fans who remembered only the joy he projected. His legacy now carries both movement and meaning. He remains the voice behind a timeless dance record and a reminder of an era when celebration and silence often lived side by side. Jermaine made the world feel lighter even when his own weight was carried alone. They gave us the voices that raised a generation love songs that still play at anniversaries, funerals, and family reunions. On stage, they looked untouchable chart toppers with audiences who believed every lyric. Off stage, many faced a world that demanded a perfect image and punished anything outside it, especially for Black artists. Privacy became strategy, silence became survival, and real battles were hidden behind polished performances. Their music delivered freedom, while their lives often could not. So here's the question that should start an argument. Were they staying quiet to protect their careers, or did America never truly allow them to live openly at all? The Black Excellence List.